In 1922, a team of British archaeologists led by Howard Carter discovered a previously unexplored tomb in Egypt, which probably belonged to Pharaoh Tutankhamun. Scientists were stunned by the find not only because of its value, but also because of the number of questions that arose immediately after its discovery. The treasures of the tomb remained untouched for 3,000 years, while others were repeatedly robbed. The world is still asking another question. Why did the researchers who entered the tomb die one after another? After the death of one of the members of Carter's expedition, people in Europe started talking about the curse of the pharaoh. They say that those who entered the tomb mysteriously began to get sick or experience one failure after another. However, if there was a curse, it began with Tutankhamun himself. But for what and by whom could the young king be cursed? Tutankhamun ascended the throne in 1332 BC. Tutankhamun was only 9 years old. The boy could not rule on his own, so an advisor named I was assigned to him. I helped the young king restore Egypt, which was suffering from the consequences of the reign of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. During his 17 years on the throne, Akhenaten carried out a large-scale religious reform. Namely, he forced the ancient Egyptians to forget about the existence of all the ancient Egyptian gods and recognize the only god, Aten. Although Tutankhamun inherited a half-destroyed kingdom, he was destined to correct his father's mistakes. This was not the real curse for Tutankhamun. Akhenaten doomed his son to suffering even before his birth. Nefertiti was long considered Tutankhamun's mother. However, Nefertiti never had the title of royal daughter, so, accordingly, she could not have been buried with Amenhotep. In 2010, the results of the mummy's DNA showed that it was not Nefertiti at all, but the daughter of Amenhotep II and his wife Taya. That is, Tutankhamun's parents were brother and sister. As a result of incest, Tutankhamun was born with a whole set of genetic defects, including deformity of the foot, skull, and cleft hard palate. He looked something like this. This reconstruction using computed tomography was carried out by scientists from France, the USA, and Egypt in 2005. Available facts indicate that he suffered real torment. And perhaps the same curse destroyed the researchers of his tomb. Almost immediately after visiting Tutankhamun's tomb, wealthy American financier George J. Gold caught an infection and died a few months later. George Herbert, Earl of Carnarvon, who was Howard Carter's partner and main sponsor of the expedition, also died of a mysterious infection a year after entering the tomb. Also 5 months later, his brother, traveler and diplomat Colonel Ori Herbert, died of blood poisoning. And here the most interesting thing begins. According to one version, Tutankhamun also died of an infection. But although scientists have been studying Tutankhamun's mummy for 100 years, they still cannot agree on the circumstances of his death. The pharaoh's mummy had a broken leg, there were bones in his head, and most of his chest was missing, which led to the idea that he was murdered. The main suspect in this case is the royal advisor I. It was he who benefited the most from the death of Tutankhamun, because he became the next pharaoh and married his beloved Ankhesenamun. I was in line for the throne only because Tutankhamun, aged 18, died without leaving any descendants. His stillborn children were buried with him. And here's what's unusual. Some researchers were also victims of murder. A member of the royal family, Prince Alia Kamalfamabe, was shot dead. Howard Carter's secretary, Captain Richard Bethel, was found strangled in his room at a summer club in London. And this was after a series of fires broke out in his house, where valuable Egyptian artifacts were kept. However, the most horrific death befell Dr. R. N. Ember, a friend of Howard Carter, who was also present at the opening of the tomb. Ember burned alive in his own home while trying to save his manuscript called the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Interestingly, the mummy of Tutankhamun also suffered from fire while in the sarcophagus. The intact tomb of Tutankhamun suggests that people were afraid to enter it, lest they incur the wrath of the gods. Archaeologists could not shake the impression that the tomb was intended for someone else. Most of the attributes in it contain the names of Akhenaten, Menhotep I, and unknown high-ranking persons, and the sarcophagi themselves were generally confusing. The fact is that 3 anthropomorphic sarcophagi were nested tightly together and placed in the so-called wooden arks. When Egyptologists removed the lid of the last tomb, they were in for another strange surprise. The mummy was charred. Studies have shown that the embalmers literally doused the mummy with oils and resins, which led to a fire in the already closed sarcophagus. Even worse, the liquid froze and glued the linen bandages together. Archaeologists were unable to unwrap the mummy and cut the bandages into pieces. At the same time, the mummy itself stuck to the bottom of the tomb. They treated the mummification process with special care and respect. They recorded their knowledge and rituals in the so-called Book of the Dead. For example, according to the scriptures, the heart was always left inside the mummy of the pharaoh. It was believed that the king needed the organ to continue ruling in the afterlife. However, Tutankhamun's mummy did not have a heart. Instead, the pharaoh was given an amulet in the shape of a scarab. In addition to the missing heart, scientists discovered other strange injuries on the young pharaoh's body, including a hole in his skull. In 2005, after a CT scan, scientists Icavas confirmed that the injury appeared after the pharaoh's death, and that was not an accidental blow, but a deliberate puncture made during mummification. Usually, the nostrils were used to extract the brain, but for some reason they did it differently with Tutankhamun. It seems that the embalmers wanted to finish the burial as quickly as possible. Perhaps they were afraid that what killed the pharaoh would kill them. And perhaps Ramses the Great, the pharaoh who ruled after Tutankhamun and raised Egypt to new heights of power, feared the same. He did more than anyone else to erase all traces of Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and other heretics from history. By his order, the tomb of the young king was built over with other burials so that it was simply physically inaccessible. Tutankhamun's tomb was considered lost, forgotten even by his contemporaries. And some scientists believe that all these strange details and the haste in mummification and burial could be explained not so much by the fear of a curse as by the fact that the ancient Egyptians encountered an infectious disease unknown to them before. And this same infection could have killed the members of the Carter expedition. But is it possible to accurately determine the cause of Tutankhamun's death after so many years? Among the most likely causes of Tutankhamun's death, scientists singled out a broken leg, a broken rib cage, and an infectious disease. A detailed analysis of the mummy showed that Tutankhamun had vascular necrotic drainage of the foot and ankle. Simply put, the bone died due to poor blood supply. But from the preserved artifacts we know that the young man relied on a stick all his life. And so before his death, he really broke his leg. As for the mummy's chest, it turned out to be unbroken, but literally missing. It was stolen in the 60s along with the pharaoh's precious collar, to which it was attached. In 2009, Zahiawas completed large-scale genetic and radiological testing of 11 royal mummies of the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom, including Tutankhamun. And he concluded that the most likely cause of the pharaoh's death was a combination of avascular necrosis, a leg fracture, and malaria. But malaria itself is not a virus, but a parasite that is transmitted from person to person only through the bites of female mosquitoes. And if this diagnosis can be considered final in the version of the death of the pharaoh himself, and all the oddities in the mummification were only a consequence of Ramses' haste, who sought to ascend the throne as soon as possible. So what were archaeologists dying from then? The mysterious deaths of Carter's expedition members have haunted many researchers for decades, but some of them had completely natural and understandable explanations. Earl Carnarvon died of pneumonia, which developed against the background of a streptococcal skin infection. He shaved the wound from a mosquito bite on his face and brought the infection into his bloodstream. It is not surprising that he later developed pneumonia. The Earl had a weakened immune system. He had been treated for lung disease for many years in warm countries, one of which was Egypt. If we recall the other members of the expedition who died from diseases, it is worth considering their average age, which was 75 years. Many of them went on the expedition already with compromised health. There was also Iron Ember, who tragically died in a fire. He had enough time to escape, but he decided to take his manuscripts with him instead. Expedition leader Howard Carter also died of natural causes 16 years after the tomb was discovered. But the causes of death of the other members of the expedition seem completely unexpected. Historian and writer Mark Bannon has found evidence that several mysterious deaths in London attributed to the Tottenham Curse were actually murders committed by the same man, Aleister Crowley. In 2011, The Telegraph published this article. Crowley was a poet, novelist and mountaineer, as well as an occultist and mystic who was obsessed with the story of Jack the Ripper. It was by studying Crowley's texts that Mark Bannon put the puzzle together. For example, it was no secret that Prince Ali Camalfamabe was shot by his wife, Maria Margaret. However, few people knew that Mary Margaret and Aleister Crowley were lovers. Mr. Bannon suggests that it was Crowley who incited her to murder. The next victim of this couple was Aubrey Herbert, who died shortly after Mary Margaret was acquitted. Imagine, Herbert was born with a degenerative eye disease and by the end of his life was completely blind, and his dentist decided that his teeth were to blame. He advised Herbert to remove them to restore his sight. But the dental operation in a private clinic went suspiciously wrong. Mark Bannon claims that there's a lot of indirect evidence in Crowley's diaries that connects him to the deaths. The most important thing is Aleister Crowley's unusual belief system, which was imbued with the spirit of ancient Egypt. It is possible that he imagined himself as the executor of the will of the gods and became the embodiment of the curse of the pharaoh himself. Be that as it may, how could one not notice a serial killer who described his crimes in his own books? Nevertheless, the totality and sequence of these deaths suggests that in some sense such a curse existed.